Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in over your lunch break, hopefully, and to discuss a little bit about data modeling in an agile world. For those that don't know me, my name is Damien. I'm a software consultant with Embarcadero. I'm based in Sydney, and I'm very happy to say a very sunny Sydney today. Spring really feels like it's here today. So yeah, I'm stuck in the office unfortunately, but it's nice to be able to sort of peer out and see some blue sky. So hopefully wherever you are today, you've got a bit of blue sky as well. So the purpose of our webinar is to sort of keep following up with our customers and with those that are interested around different topics in the space of data modeling. About 2.5 weeks ago, we actually had our product manager out from the US, and his name is Ron Hosinger. And Ron actually, we did a very brief tour of the east coast of Australia. So we started in Sydney, went down to Melbourne and finished up in Canberra. And Ron talked on a number of topics. He talked about sort of the world of big data. He talked a bit about the world of Agile, but also his sort of view of where the world of data modeling is going and how our technology is going to fit into that. So what we thought we would do is over the next wee while is to start putting together just a bunch of presentations and workshops that sort of expound upon some of the ideas that he spoke about. And today I wanted to sort of spend a bit of time talking about Agile and how data modeling can fit into the Agile world that we're hearing so much about over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. For those that aren't or are new to GoToWebinar, you'll find a little chat or a question section in your little GoToWebinar control panel. So as we're going through and there's a question, please chuck it into there, and I'll answer it on the fly if I see it, and if not, at the end of the session, I'll go through and answer each of those. Both verbally, we'll type it up and we'll get those out to you as well. I am recording this session as well, so if you've got other team members that couldn't make it today, we'll make sure we share the presentation as well as the recording with them as well. So without further ado, let's get stuck in and talk about data modeling in an agile world. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm looking here and my speaker and microphone are sort of quite high, so yeah, hopefully you can hear me. If not, just throw something into the little chat window down the bottom to say that you can't hear me. Otherwise, I'll carry on. Cool. So the agenda. So for the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to do is sort of talk about how some see the perception of data modeling, particularly those that are in a world of agile, and how data modeling is treated in that space. It's not everywhere. Some people get the importance of data modeling, but there's a very high proportion of those that see data modeling in a particular light. So I want to talk about some of the characteristics of that. But obviously, the way they're thinking about data modeling in this way is obviously coming from some sort of influence, whether they've had a bad experience in the past, whether they see modeling as something that is not as productive as it could be. There are other things out there that take the place of modeling. I want to talk about some of those influencing factors, in particular the way we do our development, but also technology that we can use in order to develop our software, which kind of almost negates the need for data modeling, or supposedly negates the need for data modeling. We've got a really great presenter in and around the data modeling circles in Australia whose name's Graham Witt, and if you grab him on this particular topic, he will talk for many an hour on it. So yeah, we'll spend a bit of time talking about that. And in particular, I'm really thinking of things like persistence frameworks and what they can give, but what they also potentially miss out on as well. And the most important thing here is not how do we scrap what we do today so we can get modeling into this world, but how do we adapt data modeling with these processes, with these technologies, to help overcome this particular perception around data modeling as well. Now, certainly we don't want to be coming in and being a complete change agent and scrapping everything just for the sake of bringing data modeling in. Now, I'm certainly of the belief that data modeling can fit with most software development methodologies and practices. And so we need to look at a way of being able to sort of get that in place. And it's also really great to say right now that there's a handful of our customers, and there's probably plenty of other people out there that are actually using data modeling in Agile methodologies as well. So it's really good to hear that. So it's interesting. I went down to Canberra. I go to Canberra quite frequently, but on one particular visit, I was chatting with a number of people, and we were trying to put together a little bit of a presentation or a workshop to sort of deliver down there. And when we were talking to these couple of people, they really saw, or they really wanted to have a presentation that really talked to the point of data modeling is still a very relevant aspect to the way that we deliver software, the way that we build our software, the way that we manage our warehouses, and so on and so forth. But what they were getting from people that they really had to sponsor their projects from, that data modeling was really perceived as a high impact exercise, that it took a lot of time to develop a model before they started developing code, which then sort of equated to working software out in the real world. So there's this perception of that we took so much time to build a model that we wasted time when we could have actually had something out there in beta and in testing. So that was the first thing. You know, a lot of the projects that were being implemented down there were very traditional waterfall type projects. And again, there was this perception of there was all this time doing analysis and detail and doing big chunks of functionality that when they started to deliver things, they were no longer in scope, they were incorrect and didn't really meet the needs anymore. So there was this idea of, well, why model when I can code? Let's go straight into this concept of, I keep hearing about Agile. So Agile means no documentation. No documentation means no models. So let's just get in and code. Let's just start doing stuff. And again, I think that's a slightly warped view of the world as well, and I think that's a very much the antithesis to the way that we've done traditional development. And I think there is sort of a middle ground, a fence to sit on that we can definitely incorporate modelling into. It was interesting at our Sydney event when Ron was here, there was a very good discussion towards the end between a number of people, where modelling was seen as something that's strategic, that modelling has a better position in the space of enterprise architecture, where it's a little bit more high level, where we can sort of make out our core entities and how they relate to our systems, how our systems interrelate to one another, and so on. Not so much something tactical where we're actually doing an ER diagram or a dimensional model or something like that. In one particular instance, we were talking about this from an Agile point of view, where these artifacts are modeled, but they're thrown away after each sprint because they're not sort of incremented upon, they're more of an iteration. So modeling can be seen as something that we'll do after the fact when we have all this stuff in place, so we can use it as almost as documentation. And that certainly has its place as well. But again, I believe that modeling can fit in to the development process, whether it's Agile or waterfall or a combination of the two. So these were some of the perceptions that are seen of data modeling today. It can be perceived as high impact. Because it's perceived as high impact, there's this real necessity for people to want to code straight away and not be bothered with the model because it takes so much time. And again, through that, they'd rather see modeling as something that's a strategic exercise, more of a graphical document rather than something that's used as part of the development process. So it's interesting to sort of know and understand if those are some of the things that you're seeing within your organisations, or that's the perception of how data modeling can be seen. So what are some things that cause this particular perception? I think one of the biggest ones that we've seen is sort of the advent of Agile. And Agile really came out of the fact that these waterfall projects were taking forever to get to a working piece of software. And by the time we got to a working piece of software, the business had changed, requirements had changed, and that 6 to 12 months of development was a complete waste of time. And so this whole idea of Agile came out where we release software more frequently. And because we're releasing more frequently, we can get better feedback. And if we get better feedback, we'll be able to understand if we're on the right track or not. And underneath the Agile development methodologies, there's a manifesto. And that manifesto kind of explains what are the sort of the key concepts of why we do Agile. And some of the things that are said in there can perhaps be interpreted as no need for documentation. And that's why I said earlier, well, you know, modeling can be seen as a form of documentation, so we don't really need that either. We can just go straight in and start doing Agile. And again, Ron gave a great example of an organisation that did zero data modelling on an Agile project, and how bringing someone in to be that data architect with data models helped sort of bring that back onto track, and back sort of within an appropriate time of being released. But what also is stemming this is the way that we do our development today as well. Many of us may use a persistence framework, something like Hibernate or nhibernate in the .NET space. But this is basically going along the lines of, well, I can start coding straight away, and as part of my code, these objects can be automatically generated that do all the persistence and talk to the database for me. And really what you're saying there is that the object model that you're using to build your software is in effect the data model. And is that entirely true? Can we, with absolute conviction, say that our object model and our data model are identical? And that's something we want to sort of talk about today as well. Again, I'm of the belief that they are two completely separate entities, because the way we design a database doesn't necessarily relate to the way the application works. And we really need to marry up the idea of functionality and performance. And so how do persistence frameworks fit into this? And should we look at the idea of data modeling as well? So they're two things that I believe that cause the perception of data modeling being high impact, potentially a waste of time, and something that's strategic, because we want to get software out the door faster, and we've got technology to handle that stuff for me. We don't really need it. Now, again, this, I guess you could frame it in terms of, application development, and doing the software side of development. But if we start looking at more sort of business intelligence and data warehousing projects, I think the need for data modeling is a little bit more critical there. So, I guess we have to look at this from a balanced point of view. So really, Agile can be perceived as this whole idea of chaos, where developers are seen to rule the roost. Agile sort of stems from the development community. Agile talks about the idea of self-forming teams, and they're formed at the start of the execution of a particular release. Again, Ron gave this great example of, the idea of an airline. And with that airline, just before a particular flight, we're going to get a bunch of the employees together, and we'll decide there and then who's going to be the pilot, who's going to handle baggage, who's going to handle check-in. Would you trust an airline would you fly with an airline that organises people like that? Probably not. You probably want specialised people in those specialised roles. And this is sort of some of the things that Agile can sort of suggest. The other thing is that we talk about just going straight to code. The idea of a requirement is a one-line user story or a one-line feature. And then from there, we'll build that out with product owner, and we'll sort of see what we get at the end of it. Testing can be done. Some Agile processes talk about the idea of test-first design and so forth. So testing can be done, but is it in isolation and so forth? And so there is this notion that Agile is really, as I said before, the antithesis to waterfall, which really leads us to a world of chaos. And people that have been involved in bad Agile projects where they've let all of this stuff happen have a bitter taste in their mouth, and that's completely understandable. And so you can sort of see why people are looking for a way of being able to incorporate these sorts of things into their practices. So from my personal point of view, I've been involved with Agile now for probably about 10 years. The previous company I worked for was, actually worked on an Agile project. And the very first Agile project I worked on was absolute chaos. It was for a small project. It was a fixed price project where we had a hard deadline, and we missed that almost by 12 months, where we changed tact many times because Agile kind of let us do that, and it gave us basically zero accountability. So in the end, I think we actually lost a whole bunch of money on that particular project. But subsequently, over time, I've been involved in other Agile projects. The R&D team that built a number of products in my previous company adopted Agile as well. One of the products that company acquired had a very influential person in the Agile space, and I learned a lot from that person as well. But if I was to pick out sort of 4 key criteria of what Agile means to me, I want to use those as the basis of the rest of the presentation. The first thing is Agile to me means frequent releases of working software. That within a shorter amount of time, whether that's a month or 45 days or whatever it is, I'm going to release something to my end users or to my testing team so that they can verify and validate what I've done. And because I get that quicker release, I get quicker feedback. And that helps me. What I do is effectively steering or correcting the course. Do they like the UI? Do they like the functionality? Do they like the flow of the logic? And that really helps me develop what I've done and what I've worked on. But, that's sort of, I guess, an end goal. But as we're doing the development, I really like this concept within Agile of repeatability through mini recipes. Now, what I mean by that is Agile itself is a recipe. Yeah, it's a very sort of high-level macro view of step-by-step processes that we can incorporate to build software. And there are so many Agile development methodologies out there. There's the idea of extreme programming. There's the idea of Scrum. There's the idea of feature-driven development, and there's a myriad of those things. But in each of those Agile methodologies, there's a subset of little steps that you might do or a recipe. So in feature-driven development, you do something called design and develop by feature. In extreme programming, you might do the idea of test first design. These little steps that you incorporate. And the thing that I like about Agile is you shouldn't have to follow a completely prescriptive course of doing development, but pick out the things that work for your project team and pick them out so they're repeatable, so that you can measure them at each release that you go through. So you can understand, well, actually, we were quite slow this time, but next time we did it with those same set of steps, we actually improved a little bit. What do we do that's better? Oh, we got better with our communication. We got better with our estimations. We actually could buy components that did better that functionality. So by having repeatability, you can measure what you're doing. And with mini recipes, you're fine-tuning the process to what's more important to your organization. And that's important because that's where I can see a way of being able to adopt Agile into the way you do your software development by incorporating an element of data design for each of the increments that you're working on. Agile also means to me there is accountability. That it's really important that at the end of each release that we stand up as a unified team and say this is what we've released, and that we are accountable to making sure that we meet our deadlines and meet our end goals. And so there are some really good examples of that. Scrum has the idea of a sprint backlog, which are the set of features that you commit to that particular release. Feature-driven development has the same sort of thing where there are a set of features that you commit to develop by the end of the month. And these are the sorts of things that really drive accountability in the project team and help drive the releases to their particular end date. So that's another important aspect to it. Some methodologies, and in particular feature-driven development goes into this, is there is a slightly heavier upfront requirements analysis component where instead of just sitting there with an end user, we say, right, what do you want in this project? Or what reports do you require for this particular BI set? We sit down and do a little bit more analysis. We try and understand the system we're building or the warehouse we're putting together and come up with effectively a logical model. And the logical model is sort of is built upon each time that we go through. But by doing this up front, what we kind of get is a good idea of the scope of the project. It gives us a good handle on saying, well, want this done in 6 months? It's not going to happen. It's probably more of a 12-month kind of project. It gives us an idea of what data sources we need to incorporate in reporting and things like that as well. So by doing a little bit more heavier upfront analysis, when I mean, again, the idea there of getting the bigger picture, not really detailed requirements, it'll give you an idea of the size of the project and the amount of effort required as well. And so really the second and the fourth point are really great parts of where we can incorporate data modeling into our approaches and the way that we can link those to our Agile methodologies. Repeatability through this idea of mini recipes, and also using data modeling to help with the upfront requirements analysis, trying to get the bigger picture of how much data is involved, the participants, the functions, and so on and so forth. So it's always important to now sort of talk about, well, how does Agile work? And I've mentioned a couple of the key criteria. And there's a bunch of examples out there of different Agile methodologies. One that seems to have got a lot of traction over the last 5 or 6 years is the idea of Scrum. Scrum, as that name suggests, is really taken from the idea of rugby, where we work together to sort of, build something at the end of it. So what we have is we have this product backlog, and effectively what you might determine that as your customer wish list. And then what you will do is you'll work with that customer to come up with a list of features that are prioritized that you're going to deliver what we call a sprint. And a sprint is a release cycle. Now, the amount of days that goes for is completely up to the organization. Most people sort of go with the idea of 30 days, sort of a 1-month cycle. But how you construct this backlog and this sprint backlog is kind of important, because we just don't want the end user or the product owner to say, I want these 10 features done. We need to understand what the capabilities are of the development team. And this is where the idea of repeatability through mini recipes comes through. The first couple of sprints that you do are probably going to be horrendous because you're still trying to find your feet as a development team and trying to understand what you actually develop in those 30 days. So estimates might be out the window, but because you can repeat the processes and you're capturing how long things take, you'll get a better idea of what you're capable of doing. So the idea here is that over time, there'll be a maturity here between the product owner and the backlog and the sprint backlog, where you'll be saying, right, well, we're capable of delivering X amount of features for this release. So these are the ones that you've got prioritized. Are you okay with this? And we'll go into this development. Now, this is where sort of Scrum kind of says, well, how you do development is completely up to you. So there is no very prescriptive way of doing that. If you look at something like feature-driven development, it's very, very prescriptive what actually goes on in here, and we'll talk about those things in a moment. But what's happening in that sprint cycle is that each day you have the idea of a stand-up meeting. And the stand-up meeting is basically between the project team, the product owners involved, as well as the Scrum leader, Scrum master, or the project manager. And basically you're going to tell them 3 things. You're going to say what you've done, what you're doing today, and what are your roadblocks. And the idea and the role of that Scrum Master is to remove those roadblocks. That is to sort of help. It's not to be a meeting that spends hours and hours and hours, but it's basically to sort of tell those 3 things. So we can figure out how can we remove any impediments so we can keep working successfully. And at the end of those 30 days, there'll be a working increment of software. Okay, so something that users can touch and feel to effectively verify and validate. And so that's the idea of Scrum. So you can see here that really in this sprint area, there is certainly a lot of scope to incorporate data modeling. What we actually might do is actually, for the first release perhaps, carve out 5 days. And 5 days might be devoted to data modeling, to come up with an initial model, so that you have that initial model based on the sprint backlog, so that the team can carry on ahead, where the data modeler can then start on the second sprint. So there might be a little bit of planning required, but there is certainly this idea of being able to introduce modeling into this particular space. So let's continue on and actually have a look at some examples of how this might work. In particular, feature-driven development. Feature-driven development talks about a model being the primary source of requirements analysis, where what we do is we spend a bit of time in these 2 steps here, where we develop an overall model, and from that overall model we build a feature list. What we're effectively building here is a logical data model. We're trying to understand the domain. We're trying to understand what is the scope of what we're trying to achieve. We're concerned with the relationships or the shape of the model as opposed to the content. So I'm not interested in the fact that there are 50 attributes in this right now. What I'm concerned with is how does customer relate to orders, okay? Or how does a player relate to a football team, or something like that. Trying to build out those relationships, because the relationships really determine how things are linked together. And that's what is typically the largest amount of work when we come to development. Filling in attributes is pretty easy, but how we construct and maintain our relationships can be somewhat difficult. And over time, we'll be adding to these to this model. What's really important about FDD though, and again for those that are very interested, FDD was actually coined by an Australian project manager. His name is Jeff DeLuca. And I believe his consulting company is called Nebulon. They're based in Melbourne. And so if you want more information about feature development, go and Google it, and he's got lots of documents and lots of information up there on it. But the idea of being able to develop an overall model, you can get a list of features. And in Jeff's experience, he has basically a formula that he can work to that effectively says for each week you spend in modeling will be, I think it's 3 months worth of development. And so he has this sort of notion that he can kind of figure out the end date of the particular project. So what we do is we build a feature list based on this model. We then set up that feature list and plan it out by feature. We break down for each month what we're going to deliver. And then we go into the development phase. And we have effectively what we call a sprint or a release, which is that monthly release. And what we do is we design by feature and build by feature. So there is a design element. And that design element might be incorporating a data model or a UML model, but then based on that design, we go and build it as well. And we do a bunch of testing. So there's a very finite or a discrete set of steps that we go through in this space here in order to deliver something on the other side. That again, that idea of a repeatable recipe. But again, this whole emphasis here that there is a model involved. And so first and foremost, you can very much argue the point, well, when someone says to you, there is no modeling in Agile, point them to FDD. Point them to this concept that in this particular Agile development methodology, modeling is a core component of it. And so if that's a core component, certainly we can then use that in other Agile methodologies as well. So that's the idea of how Agile and data modeling may link together. Certainly you can refute it and say that it's part of it. The next area that I wanted to talk about was software development technology, in particular persistence frameworks, because these are starting to then sort of replace what we do as a data model. Because, hey, if I can build an object and it can write itself to the database, then surely that's enough. The idea of these persistence framework is they take program data that's in memory. For example, I might instantiate a customer object by pulling stuff off a user interface and storing that in memory. And then what I'm going to do is once I'm happy with that information, I can write that to the database. Now I haven't had to model the customer, all I've had to do is build the object. And then behind the scenes, there's a special layer, something like Hibernate, for example, that knows how to connect to your database. If that table doesn't exist, it'll create that and push that over there. Another example of this is what we call container managed persistence from the Enterprise Java Bean specification from a number of years ago as well. So these persistence framework move the data around between the objects in the database. They manage the data source and the mapping between the objects. And subjectively, you might say that it simplifies the development process, because basically what I can do is I can just jump in and start coding instead of modeling and looking at potentially how the relationships might impact on one another. And this is one of the things that we did in one of our very first Agile projects, is we got in with a bright, shiny persistence framework and just started coding against the logic, which started out really well, but 2 releases in, we could start to realize some of the problems we were going to have with this. So I just wanted to give you a very, very trivial but simple example of this. So over here on my left, I have a UML model, okay, that kind of explains the hierarchy or structure of a little part of a little football management system that I've sort of been in the process of building. Where what I have is I have a super class called person, referee and player inherit from that. I then have the idea of a match that involves referees and players, and I can see here that a player is made up with a squad. And the way that I'm managing my squad details is I have an array of players in here, okay? Kind of looks pretty simple. I've got this match with some relationships here and so on. And what would normally happen is with Hibernate is I'd have a structure sitting behind this that would then write that to the database. How it handles squad, I'm not quite sure. It might actually just sort of store that as an array or a blob field in the database. It could be quite interesting how it does that, but the persistence framework will generally handle that for me. Now, let's have a look at something similar from the data modeling point of view, where I don't really have that concept of inheritance so much, where I have my specific referee and my player tables, if you will. I have the idea of a starting lineup, okay, where I've got these relationships here, and I've got the concept of a match. And I could have a squad off here as well, but the squad will basically just hold a squad ID and a name, then the players will come from this area here. So you can see straight away that the way that we store data in the data model is very different to how we'd store that in the object model. So there is potentially a big disconnect between how we store our data, which could lead to performance issues, it could lead to maintenance issues, and really highlights the fact that you can't really, on a complex project, use a persistence framework to then get rid of your data model entirely. And just another simple example that sort of goes along with that, I've got here the idea of, in my match, I have a name value here, which is a string. But behind the scenes, I also have a match table where I've specified here that it's a varchar of 110. So immediately I have a loss of fidelity in what I'm storing. And so if I'm trying to test this and I'm going through the object model rather than the data model, I could start putting in some very long details and wonder why it's truncating and causing the errors. So there are some really important bits of metadata that we can capture in our data model that doesn't otherwise get captured in the object model. So there is definitely the need for both of these scenarios, and more so I think from the data model point of view. Again, let's have another look at an example, because here I've just sort of hard-coded these values in here. I have a varchar of 50 and a varchar of 50 and one here of 25, and over here I've got something else. We could have a look at things like domains and so forth, which we'll cover in a minute. So some of the challenges with persistence frameworks. We have this data type mismatch between the programming languages and the relational database system that we're working on. We have different functions where the objects certainly do support a real-world process. In effect, it is like a logical data model, but that relational database is going to have highly normalized data. So we get fast storage, we get better retrieval access, we have a better way of being able to access and manipulate that data. So performance does come into that as well. So really, if someone comes in and starts talking about, well, we don't need to use a data model because we've got persistence frameworks in our Agile process. Well, I think you actually need both of these things because it helps us put an accurate understanding of our model in the project, so we can sort of see how we do our development from that. So we could also use as part of our data model the idea of domains. And domains we can use to basically focus in on what is the specific data type that I need with the appropriate level of detail within that. So I can capture that information and make sure that it's communicated to the rest of the team as well. Data models can also be incorporated and used within a sprint. This is sort of the idea of, well, how do you create a data model and then separate it out from the sprint so you can carry on working? Well, depending on the sort of technology is, but in our studio we have the idea of what we call named releases. And named releases are really good to take a snapshot of your model at a particular point in time so that you can carry on and do further development to that. But if we take this notion of spending a little bit of time designing the data model for our sprint or editing the existing data model that we have in our sprint, I can draw a line in the sand. I can say this is what the team will now use, and I'll make that available to them. The beauty of this named release is that it's read-only. They can't go in and make changes to it. They can communicate back to the data model to say they need a new field or they need this updated, but we can keep control over that during the sprint, which is a really exciting way of working. And as we go ahead and make changes to the data model, we can use this compare and merge utility to synchronize the changes between the releases that we're working on. So as the data modeler goes ahead to work on the second sprint, we can then use this compare and merge to merge those changes in at the beginning of the development second sprint. So they have access to everything based upon what they've worked on from the last one. We can keep future development isolated and keep current development up to date so everyone has the same view. And I'll show you a little bit of that in a demo in a moment. Actually, we'll jump straight to the demo now. So what I've got here is ER Studio. Within ER Studio here I have a little data model. And this data model is based on, as you can see here, a football club. And that football club in this particular diagram has a logical model, which gives me sort of, working with the business and trying to explain to me how a football club is run. So if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see here I've got my relationships between each of these areas here, and I've just put some annotations along the relationships to help explain what we mean by these things here. So I can see here a football team will only ever belong to a single club during a season. That team or that players can move to another club at another point in time. We can go over here and have another look at, the idea of contacts. So we can have a contact which is made up of these players, these attributes here, sorry. But a contact can be specialised in the idea of a guardian for a football player that's under the age of 18, but also an emergency contact. That might be someone that's important if there's an accident or something like that as well. A guardian may be responsible for more than one football player, which is interesting to know. And a football player under the age of 18 must have a guardian. So we've got a bit of detail here, which is kind of useful. And what I've done is I've forward engineered this into this physical data model that my team can start working on right now. And what we've done to facilitate that is I've come into my repository here and I've gone into the releases and I've set a named release. And I can go and have a look at the named release itself by choosing Get Named Release. And I've called that under my football club here. So if we go down a little bit further, I have something here called Sprint 1. And I can go and open up Sprint 1. And I can see that here now. And so this is all completely read-only, and the development team can actually start looking at this. Now, problem might be is, well, this is all inside RStudio, so how might they start to look at that model if they don't have a license of RStudio? One of the things they can do as well is we can expose this through RStudio's Team Server Core. And so within Team Server Core, I can log in. I can come into my list of projects here, into my football club, and I can come into my main model, and they have now a read-only view of that model with the tables, with the relationships, and they can come in and look at all these individual details here as well. They could also optionally get the whole model itself and navigate the model and have a bit of a look. So there's a number of ways that the team can get access to this model. But the important point to note here is this is a model of a particular point in time as of a particular release. And now as a data modeler, I can carry on with the next release because my piece of work is done for the time being at least anyway. So how might I continue on? Well, one of the things that we want to capture when we're doing data modeling is that product backlog that we mentioned, or the feature list, or whatever it is we want to call it. And in the latest release of RStudio, we have something called the Change Management Center. And in the Change Management Center, I have a list of tasks. And these tasks could effectively be your product backlog, or your sprint backlog, or your feature list, or insert Agile list of requirements here. But from here, I can see that each football team requires at least one football coach. So I can open that up, I can double click, and I can see here I've got a status of open. It says each football team requires one coach. There can be a head coach, and there may also be a second coach. Okay, sounds good. So let's incorporate that into this project. So what we'll do is we'll close this part down, because this is my sprint, this is my named release, so I don't really want to do much more work with this one. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to continue work on this guy here. Now there's a couple of things I could do. I could start working here because I've got that named release. It won't impact what the guys are doing. If I want to be really safe with it, I could come down into the repository. I can come into the diagrams, and I can say branch and merge the diagram as well. So what I could do is I could choose to branch here. Okay, and this branch name, all right, will be sprint branch. So this is where I'm going to start doing it. And I'm going to say sprint 2. And I'm going to incorporate changes into sprint 2 for data model. And hit OK. So in here it's going to say, do I wish to continue? I say, yep, no worries at all. Do I want to check in the diagram? Yep. So we go in and we check this change record in, and we'll say sprint 2 commencing. And I'm going to link this to a task as well. No, I'll come back and link that later on. And we'll click OK. All right, so what I've got now is a new diagram that I can start to work on. So if I just close this little piece here, I've got my sprint branch, and I can see that here. All right, so let's go to the repository, diagrams, get from repository, and here's my football club model. Underneath that, there's my football club model 2 here. So we'll get that and check that out immediately. So basically what I have now is an independent branch that I can work on without interrupting that main branch where the developers are working on the first sprint. So while I'm in here, we'll go to our logical model. Okay, we'll go down to our football team so we can locate that. So I've got my football team here. That's it here. I'm going to add a new entity. Let's call that our coach. And I'll double click on here to open coach up. And we'll go into our columns and we'll add into here first name, and we'll make that a varchar of 150. Do we have any domains? Actually, look at this, I've got some domains that I could be using. So here, rather than putting in this varchar of 150, let's use a standard name descriptor. And that will then create this idea of a consistent view of my data here. So we'll click on add. Let's do now a last name. And again, we'll use our standard name descriptor. Okay, that's done. And let's add one more and we'll say current coaching certification. All right, and again, we'll use a string identifier for that. And we'll add that and click OK. So there's my structure there. What we'll do is we'll define a relationship between that. So we'll have a link between these guys here. So I have a relationship between that. Actually, that kind of breaks what we were talking about because I'm saying here a coach can coach many teams. I guess in the junior leagues that is possible. So we might leave that for now. I'm going to save that. But what we're going to do is we're going to check this in to our diagram now. So I'm going to check that object in. We'll say yes. And we'll say adding new coach object. And I'm going to select and link that to a task. And I had a story here or a backlog that said each football team requires at least one football coach. So we're going to link that. We'll keep it checked out. And we'll click OK. So now I'm checking those values in to the repository. And we'll just check out that object. So we can see that's done now. And we're okay with that. So let's now go back to our Change Management Center and let's close that off. So this is the other really nice thing here. So I can now open this up and I can set this to now closed. But what I've also got here is I now have this link or this work item called adding new coach, and I can open this up and I can see everything that was added of that particular check-in. So not only have I incorporated modeling directly into the Agile way of working by linking it to the types of tasks we create and work on, but I'm also giving them a detailed breakdown of what actually occurred in that particular activity, so I know exactly what's going on. So let's just continue up and sort of round this out now. So I've done that work in a new branch, so it's isolated to what we were doing. So what I want to do now is merge. So I go back into my repository. Okay, I come back under diagrams and I go back to branch and merge now. And I want to merge back up to this main diagram here. So I choose merge, I hit yes. Thank you. I want to proceed. I'm not going to add another change record in here just now. And what this will bring up for me is the compare and merge utility, where I can see a list of all the changes. And so I can see here we're going to add this table and we're going to update these details here, including some metadata. And I'm okay with all these changes going through, so I'm going to click OK. And that has now been merged successfully into that data model. And again, I could then tag that as sprint 2 or do my updates and then push that on. Once that's done and checked in, I can then go back into Team Server over in this particular view here, come into my admin module and then synchronize and then push in the latest version of that data model so that everyone has access to it as well. And then we can commence with Sprint 2 based on the changes that I've made. And the data model can carry on and then move into the next sprint as well. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a view of some of the new features that we've added into ER Studio, in particular that change management center and that idea of being able to create a list of tasks. It's our very first release of that. And so the idea is that you would manually create the tasks in here that you might otherwise get from Jira or from Raleigh. It might be from TFS or from other technologies as well. We didn't want to pigeonhole it just right away, but over time we will be looking at how we can integrate that to Agile solutions. But the idea here is that we can definitely incorporate modeling into an Agile methodology. By adapting modeling work into those new Agile techniques, we can remove this irrelevance of data modeling. Modeling can be incorporated in increments, it can be linked in there, and it gives you a way of being able to see the changes, but also work in that Agile environment as well. Modeling is more than just that 2D model, but there is many elements of metadata that we can incorporate. I looked and briefly showed domains. I showed you the named releases. I showed you that being able to link it to change records and to tasks as well. And if you want to go down this path and make it a little bit easier, the tools and technologies that you use for data modeling should be sort of Agile enabled, or at least be able to sort of work in that collaborative fashion where you can easily compare and merge and isolate changes and roll them back in over time as well. So I believe I've got a couple of questions here. Um, so Yep. So a couple of things sort of as we're wrapping up as well. Um, you may be using other data modeling technologies. If that's the case, you can certainly download ER Studio off our website. So if you jump to, I can show you that as well. We can just jump into here and we can go to not that, um, embarcadero.com. And then from here, we can go up to the architectural modeling page and we come over to ER Studio Team Edition. And then from here, you can go and download a free trial. From here as well, you can access a data sheet. You can access product videos which show you some of these things and some on-demand webinars. Normally, once every couple of months, we have an on-demand webinar around a particular feature or capability that's really great to sort of complement what we're doing here locally as well. And then from here, you can also access our white papers and so forth also. So I encourage you to go and have a bit of a look here at some of our white papers, documentation, and free downloads as well. So here, does ER Studio support binary relationship modeling, a technique more aligned to Agile development than ER approaches? Great question. So there is a way that we can do that. One of the new things that we incorporated into ER Studio was data modeling for big data. And as you were saying, you know, there might be the idea of within an object, it might contain a collection, and that collection might be represented as binary data. Because that's how it potentially gets stored in the data store. So short answer is yes, you can do some of that within ER Studio. You can tag relationships to say they're going to be of a binary format and then remanipulate the DDL manually also. So just a couple more questions coming in as well. Any idea when reverse engineering from JSON files will be available regardless of the database management system? Very good question. We are looking at just being able to take in a JSON file and be able to create an ER model from that. I'll check with product management and I can let you know on that outside of this webinar. Yes, so we can reverse engineer from Greenplum, but that will be done via ODBC. We don't have a native connection for that at the moment. But you can reverse engineer a Greenplum DBMS from within ER Studio if that's something of interest. So I'm going to stay on the line for another 10 minutes or so to take questions. If you've got meetings to go to, well, I certainly appreciate your time. Certainly also love to get your feedback on what you thought of the webinar, what you thought of the content. And if there are other specific topics that you'd like to talk about, please email me at damien.bootsma@embarcadero.com or grab me on my Twitter handle, which is @Damien_Bootsma as well. So thanks so much for your time. I hope that's been a useful topic. I hope that's given you some fuel that you can add to an Agile fire discussion you might be having within your organisation. And please, if you're not an ER Studio user today, I certainly encourage you to download and have a look. And drop me a line for any questions that you might have. So thanks very much and enjoy your day. And I'll stick on the line here for further questions. Cheers. Okay, so if there's an issue with 32-bit versus 64-bit, that'll typically be a driver issue. So if you're running a 64-bit version of ER Studio, you will need the 64-bit driver for Greenplum. If you're running if you have a 32-bit driver for Greenplum, then you'll need the 32-bit version of ER Studio, and you can just pull that off our website as well. Because you're an existing customer, it won't consume another license. You just need that. But the driver and the IDE itself have to be the same bitness, if you will, so you can connect up. We've had that a bunch of times. Let me show you where you grab that from. So if I tempt fate here and we try and go to the download section. So we'll jump onto free trial here. And if we go to the ER Studio trial, you'll see down here you can choose whether it's a 32-bit or the 64-bit. So just choose either one of those and then you'll be good to go. If you've got any problems, just drop me an email later on and we'll make sure we get that out to you. There's no problems there. I've also got a couple of emails I need to get back to you on as well that I will endeavour to do today or tomorrow. So how does ER Studio handle standardised abbreviations to be applied as part of naming standards? Great question. So within ER Studio, you've got the concept here of a naming standards template editor. And within that naming standards template editor, you can come into the mapping section. And under there, you've got a list of abbreviations that you can import from a CSV or you can create your own. So in the logical, you might have customer, and in the physical, that may show up as customer as well. So you can incorporate that in there and just simply add in your list. What's really powerful with ER Studio is you can choose to execute it at a macro level, so just fire it away manually. Or what you can start to do as well is you can incorporate this at the attribute level if you need to. So if I go here to football team role, you'll see down here I can link this to a naming standards template. And by doing so, every time I go in and do a reverse engineer or an update, it will automatically update the physical model that's linked to this or the logical model if I'm going vice versa. So this is how we sort of incorporate the use of abbreviations within ER Studio. Great question. Does ER Studio have full support for PostgreSQL, not relying on ODBC? Really good question. So Postgres, the reverse engineer supporting is done via ODBC. And forward engineering, we do have a little bit more control over what we can do there. If I jump into the tools menu, you've got something called the data type mapping editor. And if I come into here and have a look for Postgres, here I can choose 8 or 9. I've got a list of how those data types will be supported when I go to reverse engineer the database. So you can go in and tune and tailor these things to fit in there. If there's a specific object type you're looking for that we don't do because of ODBC, please drop me a line and we'll get that addressed and have a looked at for you. So, this particular person here is using some of our development tools. Is also interested in looking at sort of the upper versions that link ER Studio with it. So, you know, first and foremost, if the software that you're building relies heavily on the database and there's a lot of changes occurring to that database, or you're finding you're making change to that schema of the database just by using pure DDL or a graphical tool, then I think incorporating data modeling is a great way of going. From the data modeling tool, you can really focus in on the design of the database and just spit out versions, just generating DDL each and every time. So that would be the most compelling reason why you would look at using RAD Studio Architect, because you'll get the developer version of ER Studio in there, which will really give you a good focus on making sure you have the utmost quality and detail in your database. Can you migrate Irwin models? Absolutely. Within ER Studio, there's an import option here, and we can import from external metadata. And then from that external metadata, I can choose to import Irwin. I've done that at a number of customer sites, and it's worked relatively well. Worked on some very large models with sort of hundreds and hundreds of entities and relationships and subject areas. The only thing to be considerate of when you're doing this import is because of the format that Irwin has their information in, we actually have to use one of the Irwin DLLs to get the model out into a format that we can consume. So when you do the import, it'll have to be on a machine where Irwin is licensed and accessible. But once that happens and you've done that once and it's inside ER Studio, there's no requirement to go back and use that Irwin license. So yeah, certainly encourage you to have a look at that, and that's available as part of the trial. So please have a look at that and see if that solves any issues you might have. Fantastic. I'm really glad you've enjoyed the webinar. So yeah. Like I said, we've got this recorded, but yeah, always great to hear your feedback, whether or not you thought it was useful or not, and obviously topics and content you'd like to cover. So please drop me an email or send me a tweet. Always happy to hear from you all. So thanks very much for your time, and hopefully we'll see you online or in person very soon. Thanks, guys. Cheers.